Well, hello everyone, I'm Paul, the Vicar of St Paul's, and I just want to give this short introduction to a book of the New Testament that we're going to be looking at from this Sunday onwards together as a church. It's Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. We often call it 1 Corinthians. Now I wonder, and I imagine for many of us, it's just not a book we know very well. Did you know, though, that a verse from the Bible is actually inscribed in the metalwork on our pulpit? The preaching of the cross is the power of God. So it's built into the fabric of our church, and so a good book for us to be looking at together. So who is it by? Well, it's by the Apostle Paul. He spent 18 months in this southern Greek city of Corinth on his second missionary journey. You can read about it in Acts chapter 18. He'd had a dream, a vision of God saying that he had many of his people in that city, and so Paul was to go and speak of Jesus there. This letter was written in about the spring of AD 54-55 after Paul had received a letter from the church asking some questions, as well as some worrying news from members in the church. Paul wrote other letters to them, some we have in our Bible, 2 Corinthians, some of you might remember we looked at a little bit of that earlier on in the year, and some other that he wrote that God hasn't deemed to preserve for us. Corinth itself was a bustling, busy city, a commercial city, a pluralistic city, and it was now, though in Greece and a Greek foundation, a Roman city. Like many kind of Greek cities, Roman cities then, it was known for philosophy, as much of that part of the world was. And its port, that was a big part of its business. For promiscuity, that was a massive issue in that city, as well as its play. It hosted the biennial Isthmian Games, which was like a kind of slightly smaller version of the Olympics. Now, we don't know lots about the church. Most probably it was bigger than 50 from all the names that are mentioned at the end, but most probably smaller than 200. At the end of the book, or the letter to the Romans, Paul speaks of those who meet in Gaius' house, and it may be that the Corinthian church all gathered in the house of this man, Gaius. Now, what was the church like? Well, can I say in many ways it was a church in a mess. We're only going to do chapters 1 to 6 in this first outing in the letter. It's quite a long letter, so we'll have to come back maybe in 2 other parts in following terms or years. But even in our section, we will see that to be the case. It's not all spick and span and hunky-dory, not at all. Whereas in some New Testament letters, the big theme is persecution from the world pushing on the church. Well, in 1 Corinthians, it's different. It's that the kind of line between the church and the world seems to have become blurred in places, almost non-existent. If the church is a boat that sits on the water of the world, separate from it and yet in connection with it, well, it feels like in Corinth, lots of water has got into the boat. Worldly ideas, worldly practices have kind of worked their way in. That brings us to one theme in the letter, that of disunity. Paul will write on a whole host of issues, right through from how they to relate to their leaders and the different people in their church, through to later in the letter, the use of spiritual gifts, through to caring for one another, eating food offered in the temples, the pagan temples, sexual ethics, taking each other to court, a whole host of issues. Might feel like a scattergun. Well, these were issues that the Corinthians had either asked Paul about, or that because Paul had heard reports, he felt he needed to write about. But even through those things, there is a thread, it seems, that in all those topics, as he deals with them specifically, the issue of pride and division seems to come up again and again. And so that's one of the threads. As we go through, see if you can follow that thread through. That takes us to a wider theme as well, that of grace. For all its mess, 1 Corinthians is a book of grace, of God's undeserved, unmerited love in Jesus. As Paul takes us to the letter, he begins with grace in chapter 1. He ends, the second to last verse, he ends with grace at the end of the letter. In chapters 1 and 2, we're going to hear about the wonder of the cross. Chapter 15, if we were to read it, we get this amazing chapter about the power of the resurrection. A bit like books on a shelf with bookends. The letter is bookended by grace, and it's weaved all the way through. And as Paul addresses many of these areas, it is to the gospel to that gospel of grace that he leads us to deal with those things. Not just to tell them what to do, what not to do, though we need to be prepared. There are some real challenges, and maybe we'll be unsettled by some of the things in this letter. But as he deals with those things and calls them to a certain way, it is through the lens of the gospel of grace that he leads us and calls us and shows us how that gospel empowers us to live that way as well. It's why we've called our series Grace to You. It's from chapter 16, verse 23, and our subtitle, How Jesus' Grace Changes His Church. Well, I hope you find this a stimulating and helpful series, and I hope that gives you just a little bit of a map to begin to understand where things are going in these coming weeks. Thanks for your time, and God bless. Bye-bye.